Hello, and welcome to Nothing Ever Happens in Canada, and I'm Canadian Girl. Thanks for joining me today. With Remembrance Day tomorrow, I thought it was fitting we stop and take a moment and look at our women war heroes in Canada. We've all heard the stories of our grandfathers, our great-grandfathers, and some of us even our great-great-grandfathers. But we rarely hear about our grandmas, our great-grandmas, or even our great-great-grandmothers. What were they doing while all this fighting was going on? Today we're going to find out. Join me now as we take a look back and remember some of the women war heroes of Canada. We're going to start with the most famous one of them all, born Laura Ingersoll in Great Barring, Massachusetts in 1775 on September 13th. Her family later relocated to Upper Canada in 1795, settling on a farm. Today, this is known as Ingersoll to honor the family name. She was the eldest daughter of 4 girls to Thomas Ingersoll. Her mother, Elizabeth Dewey, passed away when Laura was just 8 years old. After that, Laura's father remarried a couple of times and the family became quite large. In 1797, Laura Ingersoll married James Secord, a merchant of Queenstown. They would have 6 daughters and 1 son. In 1812, her husband went missing at the Battle of Queenston Heights. Today, this is the Niagara region. She searched the wounded and the dead on the battlefield until she finally found her husband, suffering from a gunshot wound. She courageously helped him home and nursed him back to health. During this time, the war continued outside the Secord house. The region had been seized, and enemy troops on June 2nd, 1813, entered the Secord home and requested dinner. Laura's husband James was still injured at the time, and fearing for his safety, she did as they requested and prepared a meal. As she was serving them dinner, she listened closely as the American troops made plans to surprise attack the British outpost de Crew House at Beaver Dams. Today, this is near Thorold, Ontario. The troops had to be warned. Laura's husband was in no condition to go anywhere, so Laura decided she would go herself. She left at dawn the next day and made the 32-kilometer hike. In 18 hours, from Queenston, the Niagara region today, to Thorold, Ontario, she hiked through wretched terrain, rivers, rocks, you name it. She became disoriented on the way and was helped by local Indigenous people. Together, they reached Lieutenant James Fitzgibbon and warned him of the surprise attack. With this information, Lieutenant Fitzgibbon and his men, along with the Indigenous people, gathered all their men and prepared for an ambush. 2 days later, on June the 4th, 1 U.S. general and 500 American soldiers surrendered. In 1814, a peace treaty went into effect between the U.S. and the Canadian border, and things, knock on wood, have been peaceful ever since. Our famous Laura Secord was really born an American, an interesting fact I did not know. In the end, she made a choice to save the country which was her home. she became a famous Canadian war hero. In 1860, she did receive 100 British pounds from the Prince of Wales as he had heard of her heroic story on a recent trip to Canada. She lived to be 93 years old and passed away in Chippewa. Today, this is Niagara Falls area. There is an amazing trail known as the Laura Secord Legacy Trail, where you can walk along with our Canadian war hero. The trail is 32 kilometers and runs from Queenston, the Niagara region, to Thorold, Ontario. Thank you for your bravery and your loyalty. Laura Secord, today we remember you. Next we meet Margaret McDonald. She was born in Bailey's Brook, Nova Scotia on February 26. She was the third of 11 children and became a nurse. In 1900 and 1902, she served as a nursing sister in South Africa alongside Canadian soldiers during the Boer War, aiding and mending their wounds. In 1906, she joined the Canadian Army, making her one of 2 permanent military nurses. She was sent to Garrison Hospital in Halifax to be a nursing assistant. Here, she was promoted the rank of major. She was the first woman to receive this rank. On August 8, 1914, she left Bailey's Brook, Nova Scotia, for service in World War I. She chose 100 nurses to travel overseas, and she was in charge of them all. She is the highest-ranking woman military officer in the British Army at the time, with the title Matron-in-Chief of the Canadian Army Medical Corps Nursing Service. She cared for numerous wounded soldiers and used many opportunities as teaching moments for the many young nurses. By the end of the war, she was in charge of overseeing 2,800 nurses. For her service, she was honored with the Royal Red Cross Award in 1916 and a Florence Nightingale Medal in 1918. After many years of nursing, she returned home to Bailey's Brook, Nova Scotia in 1920. It is said she had a happy retirement, and she passed away September 7, 1948, at the age of 75. Thank you for your service, Margaret McDonald. It is said that because of your outstanding nursing skills, 89% survival rate of the Canadian soldiers can be accredited to the amazing nurses on the battlefield to this day. We remember you today for your amazing nursing skills, the nursing skills you passed on to other nurses, and for the many lives that you have saved. Thank you, Margaret McDonald. Next we meet Mona Parsons. Born in Middleton, Nova Scotia in 1901, at 2 years old her family relocated to Wolfville, Nova Scotia. She is our only Canadian woman to be captured by the German Nazis and to escape. In 1937, she moved to a town called Larson in the Netherlands with her husband. Mona and her husband ran what is known as a safe house for Allied airmen who were downed and needed help out of Holland. Her husband and herself were members of the Dutch resistance. Mona's husband feared for her safety, as she was a Canadian and that made her a British subject. Mona refused to return to Canada, and she would not leave their home in the Netherlands. In 1940, while hiding Allied airmen in her house near Larson, the Gestapo entered her house and arrested her. From my understanding, the Gestapo is the secret police of the Nazis, and I am not pronouncing this correctly, so do not pronounce this like me. In 1941, she was tried in German, and she could not understand a word of the trial. She was found guilty and sentenced to death. She was sent to a German prison called Vita. Again, I am not pronouncing this correctly. While in prison, she met a Dutch baroness named Wendelin, who had once escaped before. As fate would have it, on March 24th, 1945, in the early morning hours, Mona and Wendelin were awakened by sounds of something pounding on the prison. They were right. Bombs were being dropped right above the prison from planes. The men's prison was completely taken out in one shot, and all the inmates were killed instantly. The women's prison had received a hit, knocking a hole in one of the prison walls. Mona and the Baroness immediately made a break for it. The Baroness had been caught on her last escape when heading west, so the pair decided to head north before cutting across west towards the Netherlands. At some point the two separated, and Mona continued towards the Dutch border on her own. 125 kilometers from where she started, she waved down a Canadian soldier who immediately began to help her. 2 months later, she was reunited with her husband, and in 1956, her husband passed away. So the next year, in 1957, she moved back to her home, Nova Scotia. In 1964, she would move back to her hometown of Wolfville. Mona Parsons, the only Canadian woman to be captured by Nazis and escape, walked 125 kilometers to her freedom. Thank you for your amazing story, your amazing amount of courage and strength. Today, we remember you. It's a bird, it's a plane, it's a hurricane. Wait, what? Let me introduce you to Canada's very own Queen of the Hurricanes, Elsie McGill. Born in Vancouver, BC, in 1905, her mother was the first female judge in BC. Her grandmother was an advocate for a woman's right to vote. Elsie was surrounded by strong, brilliant women in her family. Elsie would become the first woman to graduate from the University of Toronto as an electrical engineer in 1927. And 1929 would be a busy year for her. She would be the first woman in Canada with an aeronautical engineering degree. She would also become the first woman in Canada practicing as an engineer. And sadly, she also contracted polio right before graduation, which shattered her dreams of ever becoming a pilot. She was told she would not likely walk and end up in a wheelchair. She refused to accept this option and learned to walk with 2 metal canes. While recovering from the diagnosis, she drafted sketches of aircraft designs, wrote articles on aviation that were published in such magazines as Chatelaine and more. In 1934, she became the first woman in the world not only to be an aircraft designer, but she would also help design the first metal aircraft in Canada. She helped design the Maple Leaf II, which is used to train pilots. She always insisted to be a passenger on all test flights so she could best assess the aircraft's performance. The Maple Leaf Trainer 2 is accredited to being Canada's first aircraft designed and produced by a woman. Her most famous build of them all, the Hawker Hurricane fighter plane, used in the Second World War. She commanded a workforce of about 4,500 people at the age of 33. The factory is said to have produced hundreds of Hawker Hurricanes a month. By the end of the war, 1 out of 10 planes was from her company. She would also design de-icing and skis to equip the hurricane planes for the icy weather. American True Comics ran a story and dubbed her Queen of the Hurricanes. Between 1939 and 1943, she built us 1,451 Hawker Hurricane fighter planes. She went on to achieve numerous awards. Once her contract for the Hurricanes ended, she moved to Ontario in 1943. She would later on move to the States and live out her life there. But here in Canada, she will always be our Queen of the Hurricanes. We remember you, Elsie McGill, for your many accomplishments, your brilliance, and your amazing machines. We thank you. In 1941, the military changed forever. It created women's forces. Each division, all women would serve in uniform, including nurses. And ever since then, we never stopped trying to take over everything. In 1942, Mary Gray Eyes would be the first Indigenous woman from Muskie Lake, Saskatchewan to enlist. In 1943, Dr. Jean Flatt would be the first Canadian woman doctor to serve the Air Force. In 1989, Majors D. Brusseau and Jane Foster become the first 2 women fighter jet pilots of CF-18's Hornet jet fighters. In 1991, women parachute into combat for the first time in the Gulf War. In 1992, Corporal Marlene Schillingford is the first female to join the Snowbirds. In 2004, she would become the first female crew chief. In 2000, women can serve in submarines. We have some pretty amazing Canadian military women here in Canada, and these are just a small handful. Keep up the amazing job, ladies. We salute you. Many women worked in jobs covering for men while they were away. Many of these jobs were considered once for men only. Canadian women in the workforce during the time of war played a huge role in Canada's overall success during the difficult time. 600,000 women were in the workforce before the war had begun. By the end, 120,000 were employed. They worked on airfields, farms, factories, and anywhere else they could. Women's small size and dexterity helped develop fine precision in electronics, optics, and other small assembly instruments. One woman in Alberta of 9 boys, some were at war, some were working at factories out of town, drove the tractor, plowed the fields, harvested the hay and grain, took care of her children, her turkeys, and her pigs, and she also was able to tend to her garden and even get her canning done before winter. Women who worked in logging were considered lumberjills, and women who couldn't join the workforce helped out in any way they could. They knitted scarves, mitts, socks, prepared parcels for overseas with cigarettes and candy. the women became experts at doing more with less. Next we meet Veronica Foster, born January 2nd, 1922. She was also known as Ronnie the Bren Gun Girl. She was a Canadian icon for women in the manufacturing plants during the Second World War. She worked for John Inglis Company Limited in Toronto, a manufacturing company of Bren lightweight machine guns on a production line, when she was photographed and placed on the front page of the New York Times on October 14, 1941. The government used Ronnie to promote female liberation with that can-do attitude. They created a propaganda campaign of posters and photos of Ronnie, showing her playing baseball, doing the jitterbug, and touching up her hat in the mirror. The campaign let women know they could do anything. That is, until the men come home. As soon as the men came back, the campaign ended immediately. Most women were sent back home to work and were not happy about this. Men needed their jobs back. It is said that Ronnie inspired the American fictional character known as Rosie the Riveter. Today, Ronnie represents an iconic first step in the movement for women's equal rights. Thank you, Ronnie, the Bren Gun Girl. We remember you today. Margaret Brooke is a friend we all need to have. Born in Saskatchewan, April 10th, 1916, she became a dietitian before enrolling in the Navy. She began her service in the Second World War with the HMS Unicorn. On October 14th, 1942, she was aboard the Newfoundland ferry, the SS Caribou, when it was torpedoed by a German U-boat. Brooke tried desperately to save her friend, Agnes Wilkie. They held on to a capsized lifeboat. Brooke held on to Wilkie's arm throughout the night, and unfortunately at some point Wilkie passed away due to the frigid waters. Margaret Brooke was awarded for her heroism. She was made a member of the Order of the British Empire. She would eventually move back to Saskatchewan and study paleontology. And in 2015, it was announced by the Royal Canadian Navy that a patrol vessel would be named after her. In 2016, at the age of 100 years old, she passed away. We remember you today, Margaret Brooke, for your heroic attempt to save a friend. We salute you. Well, those are just some of the fantastic women who played a role in shaping our future today. With Remembrance Day tomorrow, I hope you take the time to learn your own family history and discover something you may not have known about your family before. Don't forget that tomorrow, no matter where you are, stop for 1 minute at 11 a.m. and show our war heroes, no matter who they are, men or women, how much you appreciate their service, their dedication, and their love for this amazing country we call our home, the true North, strong and free, Canada. I'm Canadian Girl. Thanks for listening, and enjoy your Remembrance Day. Until next time.
The podcast you just heard was made using Anchor. Ever thought about making your own podcast? Anchor makes it really easy for anyone to get started. It's a one-stop shop for recording, hosting, and distributing podcasts. Best of all, it's 100% free. Sign up now at anchor.fm/new. That's anchor.fm/new to get started.
you love this adventure and you want to hang out for some more, where you can be a part of an exclusive adventure crew, head on over to our Patreon page now. It's always the first link in the show notes below. You can also find our Patreon link right at the top of our webpage at nothingcanada.com.